One of the things that I found when studying historic astronomy is that you can't take many things for granted. The way early astronomers conceptualized, discussed, and approached astronomy is fundamentally different than how we think about it today. But at least one thing hasn't changed: the stars themselves. Although stars are born, evolve, and die, and they do move relative to one another, the amount by which they do so is insignificant on the scale of a human lifetime. 61 Cygni is the fastest moving naked eye star, and even over the course of 2,000 years, it hasn't even moved 3 degrees across the sky. And it's a pretty faint star that wasn't even important enough for Ptolemy to catalog. If we were able to travel back in time and view the night sky with Ptolemy, we would have no trouble finding familiar constellations. And if the stars themselves have scarcely changed, then the way we interpret them likely hasn't either. After all, many of the constellations we imagine today are obviously Greek in origin. Orion, Cassiopeia, Heracles, later Romanized to Hercules, and others still grace our night sky. So, the ancient astronomers certainly thought of the constellations as we do today. Right? 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 When we imagine constellations, we often imagine them as a series of dots to represent the stars, connected by lines, creating a stick figure that hints at the image or the figure of a constellation. However, this is not actually the modern definition set by the International Astronomical Union in the 1930s. This definition sets the constellations as areas of the sky, defined by boundaries, inside of which all stars are members of the constellation. Stick figures and images play absolutely no part in it. Regardless, constellations as areas are not how most of us would imagine them. But this isn't a channel about how modern astronomers, both professional or amateur, would view the constellations. It's one about how astronomers before the telescope operated. How did they understand the constellations? How were they taught? And where did they come from in the first place? The oldest texts mentioning constellations come from the Babylonians. The Babylonian creation myth is recorded in an epic known as Enuma Elish. This translates to when on high. Many of these Babylonian texts are given shorthand names based on the first few words of the text, as is the case here. Copies of the Enuma Elish text have been found at several sites, but all date to around 1200 BCE. However, the text is believed to be much older. Exactly how old is not well constrained, but the legend it describes is believed to date back to the 17th century BCE. Regardless, the text is divided into 7 tablets, and I've seen this text referred to as the 7 tablets of creation as a result. Tablets 4 and 5 both make reference to constellations. Tablet 4 describes one of the gods, Marduk, being given the power of creation and destruction. He promptly tests this power out by destroying the constellations and then bringing them back. Tablet 5 describes him really getting down to the business of creating the world, beginning with the heavens. It states, "He fashioned the heavenly stations for the great gods and set up constellations, the patterns of stars." In this passage, we can clearly see that there are constellations, but as of yet, we do not know what they depict or how they were envisioned. We get more information into what the constellations were from a collection of documents collectively referred to by some historians as astrolabes. These aren't the astrolabes as we think of them today, the planisphere-like instruments. Nor are they the astrolabes described by Ptolemy, which are akin to armillary spheres. Rather, these are a collection of what could be described as astronomical texts, handbooks, or catalogs, although I feel none of these terms quite capture the nature of these texts. The first of them is known as 3 Stars Each. This text describes 3 paths or sections across the night sky, each associated with a different god. Essentially, they broke their local sky into the northern, southern, and middle sections and then described a particular star from each of these paths that rises in each of the 12 months. The northern constellations were described as the path of Enlil. It lists the constellations in this region as the Great Twins, the Crab, the Lion, and the Wagon. The middle of the sky included the Bull of Heaven, the True Shepherd of Anu, and the Balance. This path was associated with the god Anu. The south was the path of Ea, and included the Scorpion, Pabilsag, another god, and the Goatfish. You can probably make some guesses as to what many of these constellations are today. We get additional references to some of the Babylonian constellations in another text known as Enuma, Anu, Enlil. Again, this name is taken from the first few words of the text and translates as when Anu and Enlil. This text is essentially astrological in nature, listing a large number of omens that readers could look for. Not all of the omens in the text are strictly astronomical. Some pertain to the weather and to earthquakes. But the text again makes reference to several constellations. Among them, we see the constellations of the Field, the Scorpion, and the Fish. Again, these might sound familiar, but aside from similar names, how do we actually know that these were the same constellations as you're probably thinking? The answer comes from a text known as Mul-Apin. Again, the name is taken from the first words of the text and this time translates as the plow stars. This text is not considered one of the astrolabes. Rather, van der Waarden describes it as an improvement upon it. The document itself is preserved on clay tablets, with over 60 examples being known at present, allowing for the full text to be reconstructed. The earliest of them dates to 686 BCE, and the last one to the 3rd century BCE. This places all of these texts well after the Babylonian period, but these texts follow firmly in the Babylonian tradition and are believed to be much older. Indeed, one of the texts has a comment on the reverse stating that it was a copy from Babylon. This text is important to our story because it gives us information about the position of the constellations relative to one another. For example, the constellation Mul-Iku, the dwelling place of Ea, the first of the stars of Anu. The constellation that stands opposite Mul-Iku is Mul-Shim-Ma. The constellation that stands behind Mul-Iku is Lu-Hunga, the god Dumuzi. This gives us a glimpse into the way the Babylonians viewed the night sky. Using this, astronomers have been able to reconstruct the areas of the sky where each Babylonian constellation would have been located. This has revealed that many of the constellations we have today date to the Babylonian era at the very latest. A perfect example is Capricorn, the area of which corresponds to the Babylonian constellation of the Goatfish. I can't think of a much more accurate description of Capricorn than a goatfish. Similarly, the Babylonian constellation of the Great Twins is precisely in the area that Gemini is today. But, as you might expect, there are many of the Babylonian constellations that are fundamentally different than what we imagine those same areas of the sky as today. For example, the Babylonian constellation of the Bow is in the northwest corner of Puppis and the southeast corner of Canis Major. The Mul-Apin text does provide a bit further insight into how the constellations were set among the stars by giving the description of where a few bright stars are in the figures of their respective constellations. For example, it tells us of a star which stands in the cart pole of the wagon, possibly Alcor, and 2 stars on the stinger of the Scorpion. But we don't get anything close to enough of a full account of the stars within any constellation to begin to piece together how the entire figure was laid atop them. When considering all of the Babylonian texts, it appears that their cosmology contained 49 constellations. However, not all of them are really what we would think of as constellations. For example, one of their constellations is the Rainbow, which is believed to be M31, the Andromeda Galaxy. The constellation of the Arrow is unclear whether it's really a constellation centered on the bright star Sirius, or just that single star. There's also a constellation known as Mul Mul. Mul roughly translates as star, so this might be translated as a bunch of stars, or what we would refer to today as a star cluster. This one describes the Pleiades. I frequently see people look at this cluster as a tiny dipper, so I suppose it's not particularly unreasonable to consider this a constellation, albeit a very small one, as it's not even 2 degrees in diameter. Additionally, some of their constellations were evidently two conjoined figures. For example, the constellation of the Eagle and the Dead Man was described as a single constellation in which an eagle carried the soul of a dead man into heaven. We also have Lulul and Ladarak, who were two distinct individuals but given as a single constellation. I suppose this shouldn't be too surprising since the modern constellation of Gemini is also two figures in a single constellation. Ultimately, we can see that several of the constellations we imagine today come directly from this period, while others would develop later. I'll drop a link in the description that has a full list of the Babylonian constellations as well as their locations in our modern sky, if you'd like to explore further. Similarly, if you have version 0.21.3 or later of Stellarium, you can go into your Sky and Viewing Options menu, and under Sky Culture, you can select Mula Pin to get an understanding of how their constellations might have been laid out, based on the reconstructions developed by Dr. Suzanne M. Hoffman. After the Babylonians, the Greeks were the inheritors of their constellations. The earliest examples we can see of this come from the ancient Greek writers Homer and Hesiod, both of whom date to the 8th century BCE. In Homer's works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, he presents his understanding of the world as a flat disk surrounded by a circular river separating the terrestrial realm from the celestial one. The Iliad contains two references to the star Sirius. The first comes from Book 5, which describes Diomedes' helm and shield gleaming with a light similar to the star after Athena inspired him. Then Pallas Athena gave Diomedes, son of Tydeus, strength and courage, so amongst all Argives he would stand out and win heroic glory. She made his helmet blaze with tireless flames, his shield as well, like a late star in summer, which shines especially bright, newly risen from its bath in ocean's streams. In Book 22, meanwhile, old Priam was the first to catch sight of Achilles as he dashed across the plain, blazing like that star which comes at harvest time. Its light shines out more brightly than any of the countless lights in the night's dark sky. People call this star by the name Orion's dog. It is the brightest of the stars, but an unwelcome sign, for it brings wretched mortals many fevers. Note the early association of astrological implications implicit in ancient astronomy. This star, Sirius, is the brightest star in our constellation of Canis Major. It's unclear if Homer understood the constellation as we do today, or took the single star as being Orion's dog. But this passage does hint at Homer's recognition of the constellation of Orion. It would be fair to question whether Homer is truly referring to Orion as a constellation from this passage, or simply Orion as a person whose dog was placed into the stars. However, we get additional clarity in the Odyssey, which tells us that Calypso made the wind fair and warm for him, and gladly did Odysseus spread his sail before it, while he sat and guided that raft skillfully by means of the rudder. He never closed his eyes, but kept them fixed on the Pleiades, on late-setting Bootes, and on the Bear, which men also call the Wain, and which turns round and round where it is facing Orion, and alone never dipping into the streams of Oceanus, for Calypso had told him to keep this to his left. From this passage, we clearly see references to several constellations, Bootes, Ursa Major, and Orion, all of which are being used for navigation. The Pleiades is also referenced and likely was still being considered a constellation in its own right. Regardless, the three previous constellations all have a one-to-one correlation to the previously discussed Babylonian constellations as far as their locations in the sky. But we now see that their names have been changed. The next text I'd like to discuss is a text by Aratus of Soli, known as the Phenomena. Aratus wrote sometime in the early 3rd century BCE, and it's believed that much of his work is actually a copy, or at the very least a close poetic restating of a work by the 4th century BCE writer Eudoxus of Cnidus. This text begins by laying out all of the constellations relative to one another, beginning with the pole and working southwards. Again, the figures of the constellations are not described, but we do get a pretty clean description of where each was placed. For example, between Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, as if it were the branch of a river, circles in wondrous way the dragon, winding infinite around and about. On either side of his coil are borne along the bears, that shun evermore the blue sea. Now, towards the one, he stretches the end of his tail, but with the coil he intercepts the lesser bear. The tip of his tail ends by the head of Helais, but in the coil Cynosura has her head. For his coiled circles past her very head and comes near her feet, but again, turning back, runs upward. Not one lone star shines on his head, but on his brows are 2 stars lit, and 2 in his eyes, and 1 is set upon the chin point of the dread monster. As with before, we do not get any concrete descriptions of the stars contained in this constellation, but with such a detailed description, we begin to get more of a feel towards the shape. Aratus tells us that Draco's head is slanted and places it near the head of Helais, Ursa Major. Our modern understanding of this constellation has Draco's body wandering between the Big and Little Dipper, but working its way away from the Big Dipper. Thus, it seems as if Aratus imagined Draco then wandering back towards it, with other stars as its head. Perhaps some of the stars in the area above Bootes. Similarly, the great river of Eridanus is notably different than we imagine it today. Aratus tells us that it begins near the left foot of Orion, but indicates that it winds its way behind the head of Cetus and ends near the star which joins the 2 fish in Pisces. In our modern imagination, it continues winding south from Cetus. Interestingly, the constellation of Libra is missing from Aratus's tour. In its place, we find an extension of Scorpio, known as the Claws. A few bright stars get their own callouts. For example, beneath both feet of Bootes marks the maiden, Virgo, who in her hands bears the gleaming ear of corn, Spica. We're also told that the tip of one of Taurus's horns shares a star with the right foot of Auriga, but, as with before, we can't fully map out the constellations on a star-by-star basis. However, by the time of Aratus's text, we can clearly see the constellations themselves are effectively the same list as we have today. A few are known by slightly different names, such as the constellation we today call Triangulum. It was called Deltaton, as it resembled the capital Delta, which is still a triangle. A later section of this text would go on to describe where the various constellations were when various zodiac signs were rising. I'll briefly mention a text by the 3rd century BCE astronomer Eratosthenes of Cyrene, which is his katasterisme. This term, katasterisme, is used to describe the mythology behind the constellations. The work itself has been lost to time, although summaries of it do still exist. From these summaries, we know that Eratosthenes had a star list for each constellation, which contained a total of 736 stars in 42 constellations. The constellations listed again are the ones we're familiar with, demonstrating that, by this time, the constellations are pretty well established. A few of the classical constellations are missing, including Corona Australis, Equus, Libra, and Lupus. Additionally, this work is the first in a body of texts which is more interested in the mythology of the constellations than their location and orientation. Aratus's Phenomena was a popular text, but not one without fault. Aratus was, after all, a poet as opposed to an astronomer. As such, it should be no surprise that the 2nd century BCE astronomer Hipparchus found issues with Aratus's descriptions of the positions of constellations when zodiac signs were rising, and set about to correct them in a text which is aptly known as Hipparchus's commentary on the phenomena of Eudoxus and Aratus. Sadly, there is not currently a translation available of this work, so it's hard for me to comment on it further. I simply wish to mention this text and its author to help situate it in the timeline, as we'll mention them in upcoming videos. Following Hipparchus, the author Geminus of Rhodes would write the introduction to the phenomena in the 1st century BCE. I should note that, despite the similar title to Aratus's work, Geminus's text is vastly different, discussing the length of days at different latitudes, moon phases, and more that Aratus's text did not include. However, Geminus does discuss the constellations in chapter 3 of this work, but his discussions on the topic is much lighter than that of Aratus. Geminus largely provides them as a list. However, we now find a few constellations that are familiar to us today that Aratus had not included. This includes the front of a horse, Equus, and a lock of Berenike, Coma Berenices. Geminus attributes the former to Hipparchus and the latter to Callimachus, a 3rd century BCE Greek poet. Geminus also lists a few constellations that we don't recognize today. The first is the Thyrsus Lance, which is held by Centaurus. We also have the Caduceus, although Geminus doesn't specify where this constellation is to be found. The early 20th century historian Franz Boll suggested that it might be carried by Orion, as a few astrological texts suggest that Orion was armed both with a sword and a caduceus. For example, Vettius Valens' Anthologies. Regardless, Geminus attributes both of these constellations to Hipparchus. Another text from the 1st century is one attributed to Gaius Julius Hyginus. This text was given many names later on, but is generally referred to as De Astronomia or Poeticon Astronomicon. For each constellation, Hyginus first provides a description of the position of the constellation in the sky with respect to others. Next, he provides a count of stars in each portion of the figure. For example, when describing Ursa Minor, Hyginus tells us, "It has a bright star at each corner of the trunk of its body, and 3 stars on its tail, making 7 in all. Now, among the stars at the bottom of its tail, there is a very faint one known as the pole star, which, according to Eratosthenes, which marks the point around which the whole world is supposed to revolve." Interestingly, the star that Hyginus refers to here is not the star we call Polaris. Today, Polaris is about 2/3 of a degree from the celestial pole, but due to axial precession, at the time Hyginus wrote, Polaris was 12 degrees away from the pole. Instead, the closest star in the tail at the time would have been Epsilon Ursa Majoris, the star at the base of the tail instead of its tip. However, even that star is quite far away, nearly 10 degrees at that time. But after this information, Hyginus presents the mythology, which is believed to be largely based on the previously mentioned lost work of Eratosthenes. The text also refers back to Aratus's phenomena, calling out errors and obscure passages. Again, looking at the list of constellations, we see that they are generally familiar to us. However, Libra is still absent from the list. At this point, most of the constellations being discussed are the ones we are familiar with. Most of the names match up, and from the texts, we can confirm that they were in the same general area of the sky as we'd expect. So, at this point, I'd like to turn further into the specificity of how the figures of the constellations were laid out atop the stars. Such specificity could be communicated in 2 ways that would persist until today. The first would be through a detailed written description of each star's position within the constellation. This would allow us to be able to piece together the figure, although there might be some error when a few stars of similar brightness are close together, allowing for multiple potential candidates. Thus, It would be really nice if we could get some coordinates to be able to plot the stars accurately. Failing that, another possibility is a detailed drawing of the figure of the constellation, accurately depicting the stars within it. The first of these is essentially a star catalog. Pliny the Elder informs us that Hipparchus had created one in the 2nd century BCE, but if he did, it hasn't survived to present day. Rather, the oldest fully fledged star catalog that we have today comes from the 2nd century CE astronomer Claudius Ptolemy. Ptolemy is known for his astronomical handbook, the Almagest, which derives the Greek geocentric model from first principles and even made some notable improvements on it. The work is actually a collection of 13 books. In books 7 and 8 of it, Ptolemy gives a comprehensive star catalog containing 1,022 individual stars. 3 stars appear in 2 constellations for a total of 1,025 entries in the catalog. For each star, Ptolemy gives a description of its location in the figure of the constellation as well as its brightness and position on the sky in ecliptic coordinates. It should be noted that this catalog is well known to have a systematic error in the coordinates in that the ecliptic longitude is off by about 1 degree on average. The discrepancy has led to speculation that the catalog itself is stolen, in part or in whole, from Hipparchus's lost catalog and that Ptolemy attempted to update it for precession of the Earth's axis but did so with an incorrect constant, leading to the error I just mentioned. Look for an entire video on that debate in the future. For the first time that we can point to, the figure of the constellation became fundamentally fixed on paper. And, given that Ptolemy's Almagest would be the primary text for astronomy for the next 1,300 years, his written depiction would certainly have some staying power. Indeed, many of the star catalogs produced over the next millennium would simply be copies of Ptolemy's catalogs, with coordinates updated for precession. There were a few attempts at creating independent catalogs, but even in the 15th century, when the Samarkand astronomer Ulugh Beg created his own catalog, he still kept the stars in precisely the same order as Ptolemy. Another way that astronomers could envision the constellations was through the use of a celestial sphere or globe. Ptolemy tells us that Hipparchus had a star globe, although the object itself does not survive. Ptolemy also describes how to make one in Book 8, Chapter 3 of the Almagest. Several astronomers around this period, in fact, recommend the use of star globes for teaching. Autolycus of Pitane from the 4th century BCE recommends their use in 2 of his texts, On the Moving Sphere and On the Risings and Settings. We also find a recommendation of using globes a century later in a letter Archimedes wrote to Eratosthenes. Geminus's introduction to the phenomena explicitly describes 2 types of globes, a normal one and a ringed one, likely for illustrating the local horizon. Hyginus twice tells us that they are essential to the understanding of the mechanics of the heavens. I should emphasize that these mechanics are not the constellations and their arrangement, but more so the arcs of important circles on the celestial sphere. Thus, it's not surprising that we find a number of extant globes from around this time period. The earliest of these is the Kugel globe, dated to the 2nd century BCE and was originally discovered near Lake Van in Turkey. Unfortunately, this piece is in a private collection, so scholarship on it is extremely sparse. However, from the images, we can see that it again contains constellations familiar to us, and Libra is still lacking. Perhaps the best known star globe is the Farnese Atlas. This statue comes from the 2nd century CE, but is believed to be a copy from an earlier Greek work, probably from the 3rd century BCE. In it, we see the familiar constellations, but again, there's no stars to ground them. A bit of coordinate grid is drawn in, but it's pretty scarce. Ultimately, 41 of the constellations are depicted on this statue. Libra is now included, although partially obscured under Atlas's left hand. Another globe from the same century is the Mainz globe, and again, we see that this globe is primarily focused on the position of the constellations relative to one another. The artist evidently attempted to draw some stars in, but really made a mess of it. In this picture, there's far too many stars hanging from Orion's belt, and it looks like the Pleiades has been moved onto the forehead of Taurus. So, perfectly serviceable for learning the relative positions of the constellations, but not picking out the stars within them without additional guidance. Many of the descriptions of the constellations we've discussed so far have been comprehensive works providing a more or less complete list of the constellations of their cultural cosmos at the time of their creation. However, I don't want to give the impression that this is the only place that constellations are found. Frequently, we find the constellations of the zodiac presented independently. The reason for this is rather self evident. These are the constellations through which the sun passes and are thus uniquely tied to the primary use for astronomy, the telling of time. The zodiac constellations are also the ones that are most important for astrological purposes, again, stressing their importance. A good example of associating these constellations with timekeeping, specifically the tracking of the months, was discovered in the ruins of Pompeii. There, a rectangular monument was found. Each of the four faces contained a depiction of the zodiac sign associated with the month, as well as other calendrical information, an agricultural calendar, and a list of religious holidays in each month. Depictions of the zodiac are, perhaps surprisingly, also found in some religious contexts. Synagogues in particular seem to commonly employ the zodiac as a motif between the 3rd and 6th centuries. This includes mosaic floors in the Hamath Tiberias synagogue from the 3rd century CE, the 5th century Sapori synagogue, and the 6th century Beit Alpha synagogue. It's hard to say exactly why zodiac depictions are found in these religious buildings. It's entirely possible that they are simply synonymous with calendars, or perhaps they understood the astronomical knowledge to be a display of their understanding of the divine. Or possibly that they were just inherited cultural staples. After all, zodiac mosaics are also found in Roman regions, such as this 3rd century CE mosaic from a Roman villa near Zaghouan in modern-day Tunisia, now displayed at the Museum of Bardo. As we've discussed in other videos, there was a brief resurgence in astronomical interest during the time of Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries CE. In this period, several classical Greek texts, many of which we've already mentioned, were collected into compilation texts or used as the basis for new texts, synthesizing several sources. One of the first texts produced, sometime in the second quarter of the 8th century, probably in the Abbey of Corbie, was a very rough translation of Aratus's Phenomena into Latin, which has become known as the Aratus Latinus. This text was combined with part of the aforementioned summary of Eratosthenes' Katasterismi and was massively popular. So much so that a revised edition was created later that same century in order to smooth out the translation. This text is also important because we begin seeing illustrations of the constellations alongside the descriptions. However, these are, again, meant to be illustrative of the concept of the constellation, not accurate representations thereof. For example, in this 12th century copy from southwest Germany, we see Pisces depicted simply as two fish instead of connected by the line as it is in the sky. This text and its revision was subsequently the inspiration for several other texts. The first we'll discuss is De Signis Coeli. The first printed edition of this, from 1543, attributes the text to the Venerable Bede, although the attribution is highly speculative and likely due solely to the fact that this text is often found included with compilations of Bede's work. However, most scholars reject the attribution. This text innovates somewhat, giving a count of stars in various parts of the constellation. This is not nearly as comprehensive as Ptolemy's detailed star catalog, but it does start providing some information to readers on how the constellations might be laid out in the sky. And, as with the Aratus Latinus, it frequently has pictures alongside the constellations described. In some of them, The artist even tried to illustrate the stars. However, because the figure may or may not be posed in any manner resembling how it's laid out in the sky, the arrangement of the stars on the figure frequently becomes largely nonsensical. For example, consider this 11th century copy from the Abbey of St. Peter and St. Paul of Bees. In it, we can pick out the two dippers on the bears, but the handles are entirely removed from the bowls, and the two dippers are entirely similar in scale. A very similar text to De Signis Coeli is the De Ordine ac Positione Stellarum Insignis. This text was based on the Germane Aratea, an independent Latin translation of Aratus's phenomena. But it functions largely the same way as De Signis Coeli, providing counts of the stars in various parts of the figure of the constellation, aside depictions of the constellation. And in many cases, we also see the illustrators attempting to place the stars on the illustration with little understanding of what they look like in the night sky. I would truly be remiss if I didn't draw attention to a particularly beautiful work from this period, which is known as the Leiden Aratea. As with other texts, this one again gives written descriptions of the locations of the constellations relative to one another, again based on Aratus. However, this particular work has some of the most stunning illustrations of the constellations we find anywhere. They are richly colored and well detailed figures, although, again, they are less than accurate in terms of their stellar positions. While the Leiden Aratea is perhaps the most lavish manuscript we have from this period, another Aratea is much more playful and was created around 820 CE. This one uses the Hyginus text to describe the lore of the constellation, but writes it in such a way that it conforms to or illustrates the figure of the constellations it is describing. Beneath each illustration, we also find Aratus's poetic description of the location of each of the constellations as well. Another text worthy of a quick mention is the Excerptum de Astrologia, which is again based on the Aratus Latinus and is just a description of the constellations relative to one another in the night sky. However, this one is notable because it goes further than the source material and includes some additional information, such as where certain constellations are with respect to the Milky Way. Another innovation came from the Islamic astronomers. In the 10th century, Al-Sufi wrote his Book of the Fixed Stars. This work presented a version of Ptolemy's star catalog in which the ecliptic longitudes were updated for axial precession. But, in conjunction with this, copies of the text have illustrations of the constellation with stars on them, numbered to correspond to the entries in the table for each constellation. However, the arrangement of the stars was still not particularly accurate. Additionally, each image is shown twice. The first image depicts the constellation as we would view it from inside the celestial sphere. The second would be if we could step outside the celestial sphere and view the constellations from the outside. If you paid careful attention earlier, you may have noticed that the constellations on the globes I showed earlier were sometimes reversed for just this reason. This text is also important because it expanded on Ptolemy's catalog. A 13th century copy of this text, now in the collection of the British Library, includes a little cloud amongst its descriptions and illustrations, which is the earliest unambiguous description of the Andromeda Galaxy. Ultimately, it seems rather odd to me that since the time of Ptolemy, no one seems to have taken the time to use the coordinates provided to produce an accurate image of the stars within the constellations. I suspect the difficulty of attempting to plot the stars so accurately was something that was believed not to be worth the effort involved. However, starting in the 15th century, we begin seeing several attempts. Among the most prominent is a manuscript from Vienna dated to around 1440 and is generally attributed to Johann von Gmunden. This map uses Ptolemy's star catalog as a source for the positions of the stars and likely served as the inspiration for the first printed star map made by Albrecht Dürer in 1515. Another important work was published by Alessandro Piccolomini in 1540 entitled De la Stella Fisse. It is sometimes referred to as the first printed celestial atlas. This work is particularly interesting because it is written in Italian as opposed to the typically scholarly Latin. This is because the work was intended for his patroness, Laudemia Fortigeri, who had lamented that women were not permitted to learn astronomy. Like the Aratean texts, this work provides a history of the myths behind each constellation, and then an abbreviated list of stars and their magnitudes. But the text also provides a map of each of the constellations. The maps were plotted accurately for each of the bright stars within the constellations, and each star was sized according to their magnitudes, with notes on how the map should be aligned with the celestial pole so that it would appear as it does in the night sky. After this, Piccolomini provides a table for each constellation in which the position of the three brightest stars is calculated for each hour of the night for each month of the year. This is intended to allow the user to determine where the stars are in the sky using an instrument that can point at objects using the altitude azimuth system. Understandably, this book was quite popular and saw several printed editions. However, the printed star atlas became a high art in 1603 with John Bayer's Uranometria. As a source for the stellar positions, Bayer made use of the stellar data from the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, who produced the most accurate pre-telescopic observations of the stars. However, this was supplemented with other observations. In 1595, Pedius Planicus hired and trained the ship's pilot Pieter Kieser to make stellar observations during one of his trips with the Dutch East India Company. Although Kieser did not survive the voyage, his records made it back, and Planicus created 13 new constellations. This included Apis, Chameleon, Dorado, Grus, Hydrus, Indus, Musca, Pavo, Phoenix, Triangulum Australiae, Tucana, and Volans. Bayer combined these sets of data, and the positions were carefully plotted out on a celestial grid, and the figures of the constellations were beautifully engraved by Alexander Mayer. However, for some reason, Bayer drew many of the human figures with their backs to the viewer in the Uranometria. This caused issues when comparing to the Ptolemaic layout as it switches the left-right orientation of the body. Bayer also labeled the stars, using Greek letters to make them easier to reference, and although this was not exactly an innovation as we've seen with Piccolomini and Al-Sufi, this time it stuck. The labels given to the stars in this publication are still widely used by astronomers to this day. So what have we learned in this video? First, many of the constellations we have today have ancient origins, dating from the Greeks, if not the Babylonians. From their texts, we know that the constellations were laid out in the sky in familiar patterns, but it wasn't until Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE that we have a record of which stars made up which portions of the figures of the constellations. However, despite having this, most depictions of the constellations remained figurative in nature, not placing the stars in anything resembling an accurate manner. Al-Sufi's Book of Fixed Stars was one of the few counterexamples. This changed during the Renaissance, when printing allowed for elaborate star atlases to be reproduced with little effort, leading to a golden age in the depictions of constellations. The age of exploration added new constellations in the southern skies, and astronomers slowly added new constellations to fill in gaps between the more prominent constellations. Many of them failed to be adopted when the International Astronomical Union devised the official list of 88 constellations in 1922. Although professional astronomers redefined constellations into areas of the sky in the 1930s, the figures of the constellations continue to serve as a crucial starting point for amateur astronomers and stargazers learning to navigate the night sky. They provide an accessible framework for learning the night sky, helping newcomers make sense of the vast expanse above. In this way, constellations maintain their timeless significance, bridging the gap between the ancient and modern understanding of the cosmos.